Previously on Rocket War.
Saddam Hussein had some voluminous rockets at that time.
There are people that are cranking up the casualty figures and scaring the Privy Council because Saddam's chem capability was extant in the 80s.
We were capable of doing everything that the coalition needed, and we weren't going to be used for that. So that was a bit frustrating.
Of course, it was a CNN war.
The Saudi military says there were 2 incoming Scud missiles intercepted by Patriot missiles arcing into the night sky over the Saudi capital. However, after the intercepts, eyewitnesses reported...
From Knockabout Media, I'm Ryan Barnett, and this is Rocket War. In the last episode, we explored the air war over the Persian Gulf through a Canadian lens. Today, we turn to what came next, as Canada's involvement deepened, and what that shift meant for the people sent into harm's way. This is Episode 3, Boots on the Ground. The British were among the Gulf War's major coalition partners. The 1st British Armoured Division was the core of their ground element in Saudi Arabia. The division was trained to use fast-moving tanks and armoured vehicles. If they couldn't outmaneuver the enemy, they could outgun them. It was this ability that made the 1st British Armoured Division a main player in the coming ground invasion. And mass casualties were expected on both sides. The British government, in fact, worried that there wasn't the medical infrastructure necessary to care for all those casualties. They had 3 field hospitals, its general hospital in Riyadh, and a hospital ship sitting offshore. More would be needed. So they put a call out.
The British military, sort of coming up to Christmas of 1990, asked would Canada provide a field hospital because the Brits were short one.
Chris Linford was a nursing officer with the Canadian Field Hospital. As Canada assessed its ability to meet this request, the outlook was not good. An October 1990 report by the Auditor General of Canada stated that the military's medical system was neither staffed nor equipped to fight a conventional war. In other words, the number of full-time doctors and anesthetists available to meet the needs could be counted with the creative use of one man's fingers and toes. In fact, No. 1 Canadian Field Hospital, the only Canadian field hospital, was staffed by members working on call while doing other work across the country.
I was established as what they call an augmentee to 1 Canadian Field Hospital, which was a unit that was essentially crated and in storage in Petawawa, Ontario. And it had a skeleton crew that basically sustained all of the equipment, and it was sitting in Petawawa ready for deployment at any given moment.
When needed, these augmentees would be called to Petawawa to train before deployment. But despite these shortcomings, on the 16th of January 1991, the Canadian government answered the call. 1 Canadian Field Hospital was going to war.
Now, those of you tuning in for the news at this stage in Eastern Canada, this is, in fact, the news tonight. We're in the midst of our special coverage of the Gulf War, what we're going to try to do in the next half hour.
We at National Defence Medical Centre heard, actually on the news.
This is Nursing Officer Rebecca Patterson, or Gowthorpe, as she was known at the time. Rebecca was a Navy sub-lieutenant, which is equivalent to the Army rank of lieutenant.
And I remember watching the Prime Minister speak and say that he was going to commit a field hospital to support the British in the ground war.
This again is Chris Linford.
And of course, at that time, my wife was very pregnant. The 7th of January, 1991, I was on leave for the birth of my daughter, who arrived very early that morning. And after the birth, a couple hours later, I was at home and my phone rang, and it was my boss telling me, "You're going to the Gulf." And I watched the color drain from my wife's face. And then that started the wheels turning on going.
Once the announcement was made that 1 Canadian Field Hospital was going to war, the 536 hospital staff members traveled from all corners of Canada to Petawawa for training. At this time, Saddam Hussein's regime had a documented history of using biological and chemical weapons. Their past use meant that these weapons remained a very real threat to anyone serving in the region. Chris Linford remembers his training to work in a chemical environment.
We began to see very, very quickly that this was going to be very hard to do our job. And of course, our casualties that come in, they could have physical injuries from, regular weapons, but they could also have a chemical or biological injury. So it became very clear to me, this is my opinion only, I think it was pretty safe to say that you would not survive, just with the time needed to care for all those pieces.
And it takes a drop of nerve agent to kill you, is a good way of putting it.
The field hospital staff also prepared their bodies for chemical warfare. Howling clay, which was used to absorb chemicals on the skin, was thick and hard to massage through hair. This posed a particular problem for the women on the staff, as long hair was exceedingly difficult to decontaminate.
So we actually all went to the barber in great sisterly solidarity and had our hair cut off.
Private Tim Courtney, an infanteer attached to the field hospital, remembers some of the other preventative medical measures they underwent.
We started doing a regime of what we called NAPs. They were called nerve agent protectants.
But it wasn't just pills they were given.
So I can remember on immunization day, I'd had at least 2 or 3 in each hip and 2 or 3 in each arm, all in one day.
Arms and butt cheeks full of vaccinations, and you don't always feel so good.
After all that immunization and training, always too much of one, never enough of the other, it was off to the Gulf.
We were all stuck on school buses and drove from Petawawa to Trenton in the freezing cold. My side of the bus was so frozen we stuck to the windows.
Off the bus and onto the plane.
And then they jammed us on an old military aircraft. Everything was jammed under the seat in front of you and between your knees.
Germany was their first stop.
We picked up more of our colleagues because 4 field ambulance used to be in Germany, and then the next day or so we headed back on the plane and over to Cyprus.
Then, on the 29th of January, there was a surprise attack by 3 Iraqi divisions. They pushed a joint U.S. Arab force out of the Saudi port of Kafji. This setback was temporary. Fierce fighting and an onslaught of coalition air power recaptured the border port by the 1st of February. Nearly 50 coalition troops had been killed, many by friendly fire, while Iraqi dead were estimated at about 70, with hundreds more missing, wounded, or captured. The field hospital would stage itself only 250 kilometers south of Kafji.
Our equipment had been loaded up in the Port of Montreal and moved over to Al Jabal, which is a port city in Saudi Arabia, right on the Gulf, and that would be our staging area for the main body.
The staff were united with their kit in Al Jabal, now a bustling military logistical hub for the coalition. Despite the recent heavy fighting nearby, there was little for the staff to do at present, but wait.
Super hot and not much to do until the ground war was to start. So there was plenty of lounging about and a little bit of training and getting used to each other. A lot of the people I deployed with had never been in the field before or hadn't been since their basic training.
During this time, they were met with a familiar but surprising challenge in Al Jabal: heavy rain.
Now keep in mind, January and February in the desert in Saudi Arabia is winter, and there was a lot of rain. And it basically turned the sand into a quagmire.
The hospital staff experienced what generations of warriors have described as long periods of boredom, interspersed with intense fear.
We started getting Scud attacks at night, and every time a Scud was launched, it was picked up by radar and the alarm was sounded, and we considered it 100% of the time as a weapon of mass destruction coming.
It was at least every night there would be Scud alarms going off, and because we never knew what the warheads had in them, it was what we used to call top high. So you'd wake up, startled awake, throw on your gas suit, and lay there.
As other veterans of the Gulf have described, the Iraqi Scud was not the world's most accurate missile. The Scuds were also hindered by a type of air defense missile called
Patriot missile batteries. So it was quite fascinating to hear the alarms for Scuds incoming. You would see them up above the fairly low cloud cover, and then you would see the Patriots launch go up, and that light meet that light and take the Scud missile out.
However, despite these protective measures, the Canadians didn't take these threats lightly.
But I can tell you, hand on heart, that every time that NBC alarm, nuclear, biological, chemical alarm went off, we all went to full MOP 4, like full coverage. We may have been grumbling about it, like every good soldier grumbles. But none of us had the confidence enough to know what was in that Scud.
And what goes up must come down. Even if the Scud was destroyed overhead, any potential chemical or biological agents could still land on the service personnel. No system, including the Patriot missile, is perfect, but the radar-guided dome of protection over Al Jubail was close. But like Rebecca Patterson says, close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. This is Chris Linford.
We had one Scud missile get through the Patriot web, and it hit the ground not too far from us and sadly killed a British soldier that night. So that was quite sobering for us as we embraced the idea that people are going to get hurt in this war.
The stay in Al Jubail also came with NBC warfare briefings.
Somebody in our group asked, if we get slimed...
Slimed was slang for a chemical or biological attack.
If we get slimed as a hospital in our area, would we get decontaminated? Our hospital could operate in a dirty environment for quite a while, but we all know that eventually that system fails. Agents could be introduced when people are not completely decontaminated.
The tents used by the field hospital repelled NBC weapons, but they too weren't impenetrable.
So the word came to us that if that happens, keep working as long as you can, and we will try and rescue you. But no guarantees.
In other words, if they were slimed, help may not come in time.
I can remember hearing how quiet the room got when that was delivered to everyone, because everybody's now all of a sudden sitting there thinking, okay, we're here, we're in danger, and we will do our job well, and in the end, we might all perish just because of the threat. And that was a sobering thought for me.
Soon enough, it was time for one Canadian field hospital to move north to Al Kasuma and join its British sister unit, 32 Field Hospital.
A decision was made, along with the British, that we would only deploy part of the field hospital up to Al Kasuma.
I got pulled into the DCO's office. He called me in and he said, so I need to move 18 wheelers up to Al Kasuma. And he says, I need to put a Canadian soldier in each one of them, and I want you, Linford, to run the road move. I was assigned to do this along with 17 other medics. Be putting one in each truck, and we would make our way north.
Complicating the move was a communication barrier between the staff and their local drivers.
So my DCO said, as you're giving your drivers their briefing, just take your 9mm out and cock it, and then put it back in your holster. He says, they'll understand that, so that you're in charge. So that's what I did. I took my 9mm out and cocked it and put it back in the holster, and that seemed to get their attention.
Pistol readied, the convoy mounted up and rolled off toward Al Kasuma. All was going well. That is until they neared the end of their move.
And all of a sudden I heard this massive big bang, and I looked out the back window and all I could see was flames and smoke. And I thought, okay, so we're taking direct fire. We've been hit, and the truck is starting to kind of skirt all over the road. So as the truck kind of slowed down a little bit, I opened the door and jumped out into the ditch on the side of the road. And as I jumped out, I felt this piercing pain in the back of my left calf. And I thought, oh, crap, I've been shot. Anyway, of course, all my other drivers behind me had no idea what had happened to me other than they saw my truck on fire and me jump out. So they all stop their vehicles and they come running forward and form an all-around defense around me, just getting ready to defend.
But it was a false alarm. The convoy hadn't been fired on. No one had been shot. The truck's motor had exploded, and Chris had been hit by a piece of hydraulic line. The convoy would eventually continue on.
We hit Al Kasuma at about 9 o'clock at night and rolled into camp. I opened the door of the cab, and my boss was standing there, and she said, thanks for bringing the trucks. You start your duty at midnight. And that was the night the ground war started.
ahead for a ground offensive. Allied troops forced their way into Kuwait. This is CNN's continuing coverage of the war in the Gulf. I'm Molly McCoy.
And I'm Dave Michaels. Here's the latest. The ground portion of Operation Desert Storm apparently is proceeding with dramatic success for the Allies. Ground forces from several countries swept into Iraq and Kuwait today.
Deep into the night of February 24th, 1991, coalition tanks and armored vehicles roared to life along the Saudi border. They then rolled across their start points towards the bombed-out remnants of Iraqi positions. Machine guns chattered, spraying streams of red and green tracer bullets between the fighting armies. Aircraft streamed overhead and radios crackled as tens of thousands of soldiers came to grips in the red sand dunes of the Arabian desert. The ground war was here. Up on the front line, wounded Iraqis were searched and given first aid by coalition troops. They were then loaded onto Chinook helicopters and transported out of the combat zone toward medical care. When they landed, they were carried by stretcher to the hospital.
So I was lucky. I started off in the British Field Hospital, which was considerably more austere than a Canadian field hospital. So I worked 12 hours there, receiving the first casualties of the war coming in, and it was steady and plentiful. And they were 100% Iraqi. There were no friendly casualties during that first day of action, as I recall.
Chris recalls working 12 hours in the British hospital, then rather than taking rest time, moving over to the Canadian Field Hospital for another 12-hour shift, and then back again.
And this went on for 4 days.
There was more than enough work to go around.
We get most of the worst patients because we're the closest surgical facility. We got what was left alive.
Those poor soldiers from Iraq were in terrible, terrible shape.
Most of them came in with no shoes, no socks, severely dehydrated.
Amazing injuries that I had never seen before, multi-system traumas where multiple amputations, as well as some pretty traumatic head wounds from rocket fire. Bodies completely filled with tiny little perforations where small bits of rocket had entered their body, be just peppered with these little penetrating wounds.
If we look at a desert and how a war would happen within a flat area, there's no cover out there. So you're basically digging in. So upper torso injuries would be very significant during that war.
Blast injuries were the most common.
Not a lot of small arms fire wounds at all, because really it was a war of rockets and used by the coalition forces as well.
And what stays with Chris isn't just the scale of the injuries treated, but how inconsistent their outcomes could be.
Like a man coming in missing 3 limbs and completely shattered and maybe even missing an eye or 2 and survive. And then the next guy comes in who looks like he's taking an afternoon nap on the stretcher, and it takes some scrubbing to find that one little perforation right in the center of his forehead where a piece of shrapnel hit, and it simply shattered his skull, and there was no way he would survive. So it was interesting to see what little it would take to kill a man, and also what a man could take and survive.
Under the laws of armed conflict, military medical staff must care for all wounded equally, regardless of which side they fight for. And for Iraqi soldiers, treatment was only the first step. Once they were stable, they were taken into custody. This again is Chris Linford.
We had a POW, prisoner of war camp, not probably 6 or 7 kilometers from our location. It was designed for fairly low numbers, but it got quickly overwhelmed. So the RCR were tasked to help out.
The Royal Canadian Regiment, an infantry regiment, had sent one of its companies to the Gulf along with the field hospital. Charles Company, based out of London, Ontario's Wolseley Barracks, was full of proud royals like Private Tim Courtney.
In my platoon, I had a great group of guys. I should mention their names: Karen Bine, Dave Bona, Tyler Turcott, Joe Melbourne, and also Johnny Evans. We were deployed together as a group. We watched each other's back, and we did the job well.
Tim remembers how the Canadians didn't quite blend in with the British guards at the POW camp. While everyone else had desert gear, the Canadians showed up in green uniforms and green berets. their one nod to the heat, was a beige, wide-brimmed Tilly hat, worn by almost everyone except
Charles Company. We kept our berets on. We just wanted to show that we were wearing our RCR cap badge in pride.
But they weren't there to show off. Tim remembers the routines at the POW camp, working alongside British guards and Iraqi prisoners. There was a method to it all, a clear demonstration that escape wasn't an option, followed by order and control. Prisoners were quickly separated by rank, cutting off lines of leadership before they could form. Each man was searched for weapons, identification, or anything that might pose a risk. And throughout it all, Tim recalls that both the British and Canadians were careful to follow international rules, ensuring prisoners were protected from the dangers of the war zone, even as they were contained.
And these poor soldiers, wounded soldiers and POWs would come to us, but we couldn't handcuff them because it was unfair for them to not be able to at least cover their faces if there was a Scud missile that actually dropped over our camp and deployed chemicals.
And they didn't strike me as being, soldiers.
Up close, Saddam Hussein's army wasn't exactly as fearsome as they looked from afar.
They were more old men and young boys. And then we later found out that the Iraqi military had cleared out a lot of the villages and towns, and anybody that was considered to be of fighting age would get a gun and be put on the front line.
The main rifle that they were using was the AK-47, but it was actually a 22 insert in the AK-47. They were just basically pelicans that would ricochet off of anything as a 22 caliber rifle.
There is a particularly famous picture of a young Iraqi soldier who was conscripted off the street, we think, because he was still wearing his dancing shoes and had been quite profoundly injured, blast injury, missing parts of his limbs, chunk of his head gone.
My last two missions were actually offensive bombing missions.
This is Captain David Deere. Once the ground fighting began, Canadian CF-18 fighter pilots like Deere were tasked with bombing enemy positions in support of coalition ground forces.
So the first one, our target were troop movements northwest of Jalalabad, and we carried 8 500-pound Mark 82 bombs with that. And so if you do the math, that's a lot of poundage, right? Pretty significant weaponry.
However, in a fast mobile war like this, the 500-pound bombs David and his squadron carried couldn't be dropped in bad weather.
They were dumb bombs, they were not guided. The trajectory is simply based on the ballistics of the airplane delivery. So how high you were, what angle you were at delivering it, what speed you were at, the present winds.
Friendly fire from aircraft was common during this war. In fact, half of the coalition casualties at the Battle of Khafji were caused by friendly airstrikes. The coalition rapidly adapted to prevent such incidents. Risky missions, like David's second planned mission, were just called off if conditions weren't right.
So we didn't get clearance to drop, and so we turned around and came back.
Wounded conscripts and friendly fire casualties marked a human cost for the conflict, but they were not the only scars left behind. The ground fighting itself lasted just over 100 hours, but its consequences were far more enduring.
As the Iraqis were pulling back, they were destroying oil wells and setting them on fire.
In interview after interview, veterans spoke about the burning Kuwaiti oil wells, an environmental catastrophe that continued long after the guns fell silent.
And all of a sudden, as we approached noon that day, the sky just started to get dark. And by 1 or 2 in the afternoon, it was like night.
Did see the glowing from the fires going northbound and coming southbound.
And that just created a plume of toxic air in the area. You couldn't hardly even see because it was so black.
And I was out on the deck, and I call it the COVID mask, right? The surgical mask. That's the only thing we had to protect us. And after the aircraft took off, I took that off, and I could wring it out with the amount of oil that was in that mask. I went like that, and it just squished down like a dishcloth. The ship was covered in oil.
You could see this black haze all around us, like in the air. You could smell it, you could taste it.
My white Tilly hat that I was issued just a couple weeks earlier became very, blackened and oil stained very, very quickly.
And then the other part that came with that as well is we were still required to take medical countermeasures to give us slightly more time to react should we be hit with a nerve agent. And you could have side effects from those medications. And certainly, I, like many, did get the tingling. And you're thinking, is that the oil stuff on me, or is it the medication?
Next time on Rocket War.
He had taken a seizure on the ship. At the Halifax infirmary, they did a biopsy, and yes, it was indeed a brain tumor. It was a stage 4 glioblastoma multiforme brain tumor. So he looked at me and he says, "Hun, this is because of my service in the Gulf."
Rocket War is an original production of Knockabout Media, written by William Patterson and hosted and produced by me, Ryan Barnett. This podcast was made possible thanks to funding from Veterans Affairs Canada's Commemorative Partnership Program. It features original interviews with Tim Courtney, Harold Davis, David Deere, Chris Linford, Donald MacPherson, Dr. Sean Maloney, Nathasha Mohr, Paul Molnar, Jean Morin, Claude St.Onge, and the Honorable Rebecca Patterson. Voice direction by Sonia Jamidi. Our series consultant is Jean Morin. If you enjoy this podcast, please rate and review, as it helps people find the show. If you're an educator and want to incorporate this series into your classroom, we have a list of discussion questions that can be found in the show notes or downloaded from our website at knockaboutmedia.com. There you'll also find our other shows, which include Among Equals, The Black Hum, Story Girl, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood North. Thanks for listening.
A Knockabout Media original. Hold on.